Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Jamie Ramsden, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from North Carolina. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about creating a sense of community in a highly fragmented workplace and world. And I think this is a super important and a timely topic. Certainly, when we think socially, politically, things are very fragmented, very divided, and polarized. And, hopefully that's not necessarily the case in people's workplaces, but certainly we have some of those aspects that can creep into workplaces. And then you have the added component of remote work, hybrid work, distributed workforce, fragmenting workplaces. And so all of these things together create an extra challenge when workers are wanting to connect and when employers are trying to connect them. So we're going to try to unpack this and explore this together today. As we get started, I wanted to share Jamie's bio with everybody. Jamie Ramsden is CEO and founder at Adastra Leadership. He is an executive leadership coach and former CEO and is the author of Let's Go. There's a whole lot I could say about your background, Jamie, but I'm going to pause there. Anything you would like to highlight before we dive on in?
No, only that we just celebrated 10 years of Adastra. We celebrated 10 years. Before that, I was the CEO for 10 years. So hopefully these insights come from practical experience as well as some theoretical underpinnings.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, let's dive on in. And first, perhaps we can set the stage, just thinking about the more general shifting landscape in the world of work. We live in a time of great change. We live in a time of increased complexity. We live in a time of, as already alluded to in the introduction, like of divisiveness, of polarization. We live in a time of disruption with technological disruptions, with work design disruptions. And so change is the name of the game. Trying to set the context for this discussion today, like what do you see as kind of the hallmarks of great leadership in the 21st century within this context, within this dynamic? And then we can start to move into, leveraging that to create this sense of community.
Yeah, well, as I get to coach leaders in organizations, I'm often struck by how different it is from when I was a CEO back in the 2000s. Sort of the pandemic had an impact, technologies had an impact, there's been social fragmentation. People's careers, take a very different pathway than they did certainly in the 1980s and even in the 2000s. The pace of change, the access to resources and information that we carry around in our pocket, that's all very, very different. And yet, right, sometimes I like to bring people back to the historical precedent, which is if you looked at 1980 to 2020,
Sure.
And then compare and contrast with 1880 to 1920, when you think about the pace of change or the technology innovations that created the automobile, the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, radio, camera, telephone, like we think, every generation tends to think that it's special. But I think if you go back, included that 1920, included a global pandemic and a world war.
Yep.
And so I think, sometimes I like to anchor myself and my clients in the historical perspective and saying, okay, yes, it's changing. It feels like it can feel very stressful and uncertain, this change. And yet, right, anchor yourself in historical, anchor yourself in what you know, what you can do, and what is the same, what has continued to be the same, because leadership is ultimately about people, at least for now, right? Well, carbon-based life forms are leading carbon-based life forms. Leadership is about people. And so actually, when I did my research back in the early 2000s, my study was, I'd hear all the same kind of breathless conversation about how technology is going to change the world and change the way that we lead. And I was curious about, what are we changing from? What is evolving? What is leadership at its essence? And so I went and did some research and I looked at the history and I ended up developing a theory that ended up being the book. What hasn't changed is that leadership is about people. It has been the same for 10,000 years.
Yeah, 100%. And of course, the context within organizations, the context within the broader economy and the labor market, those have shifted dramatically, and the technology around us and how we do our work has shifted dramatically. But it has been and always will be about people, right? Yes. And so you're absolutely correct. And we're social animals, human beings. And so if we can recognize that at the core of all good leadership is human connection and building trust amongst humans, then it leads us directly into kind of our focus for today around sense of community.
Mm.
Because it's hard enough to create, a cohesive sense of shared community, meaning, purpose, belonging when you have, barely like-minded people together in a physical space. It's hard to do it then, but it's extra hard to do it when you have distributed workforces, when you have people bringing, varied divisive ideologies into the workplace,
Mhm.
all sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And but the human need and desire for human connection, and the fact that we're social animals, and the fact that leadership is a human enterprise, that all remains true. So how do we like start to lead within this context, perhaps in a different way than we have before?
Yeah. Well, I think, to the point you made earlier on, the model I have is based around the leader as role model, leader as community builder, leader as sense maker, and leader as future shaper. And the
Mm,
community builder. So how do leaders create the conditions for a community to emerge? Because my definition of leadership is galvanizing a group of people to build a better tomorrow. And so again, that's consistent. That has been the same throughout human history. How can that, how do we, if I think about sort of Peter Capelli talks about in his latest book about sort of in defense of the office or supporting like people coming together. And I know
mhm,
Michael Platt also at Wharton talks about like synchrony, like our brains and our hearts get in synchrony when we're physically in the room together. And so, how do we replace that, the creativity and the innovation and the innovative capabilities and capacities, as well as that connection and collaboration that we have as human beings? And so one of the things I think about is, in my day, that was kind of taken for granted. Like, so we were
yeah,
in the same place and that water cooler talk or the hot corridor talk or just the meeting after the meeting could happen very informally and in person. Now we have to be super intentional about it. And so the leader has always had to create the conditions and create the container for connection and collaboration and trust to occur. Now it's just, for people to be heard and understood, included, valued, appreciated. That's always been the leader's role. But there's so much more intentionality that we need to bring to it today. And so, people are figuring it out, like in many things, the technology arrives and then we figure out how to best use it. There's normally a lag, so technology can help us to optimize. We have to identify how it can help us to actualize and self-actualize. And so the leader has to think about how can we use we've got different modalities now. We still, we have the telephone that allows us to communicate effectively, albeit not in person. Now we have a video version of that. We also need to supplement that with how do we meet on site and when and where do we meet on site. And so certainly one of the things I've seen is the fragmentation is in about things that we took for granted maybe 20, 25 years ago.
hmm hmm
Now we have to create like intentionality around how am I creating this space for us to come together? And many of my clients are doing it in different ways, right? So some of them will have, on site, they'll have, they'll adapt their hybrid policies, or they'll have collaboration weeks where they all come together, senior leaders come together. That helps to mitigate the downside of us not being together. But I think that, as to your point, as human beings, if we're galvanized around a singular goal that we're trying to use or leverage or implement to build a better tomorrow, that trust cannot be built without being in person somehow. And so there's just another element of leadership. It's probably more of a focus that we previously maybe had. It's like, how do I create the conditions and how do I create the container? And technology can both be a detractor and it can be a tool. It's neither good nor bad. It is simply a different modality for us to be able to create the conditions and create the container for connectivity and collaboration, creativity and innovation to take place.
Yeah, absolutely. And the intentionality piece that you mentioned in that, yeah, I do think we largely took connection for granted in the workplace pre-pandemic. Now, there have been remote workers and remote teams,
Sure.
teleworkers, for forever. Like, that in and of itself is not new, but what was new during the pandemic was just the scope and scale of it, right? Because everyone all of a sudden had to go that direction, and it was very new to a whole lot of people. But yeah, so now we're in the space where, some have had return to office mandates, others are still remote or maybe hybrid in some way.
Mhm.
And the question is, how do we continue to connect and how do we continue to collaborate in effective ways? And it all comes down to intentionality.
Mhm.
Because whereas it might have organically happened via water cooler conversations or, hey, I'm just walk management by walking around and I'm just having chats with people, those sorts of things when you're distributed don't work, right? Like you just have to be able to be more intentional. And so it's not necessarily about the modality as you referred to. Like it's not that in office is inherently better or remote is inherently better or hybrid or whatever. Like it's all about the intentionality in the container in which you create the community.
Mhm.
And we've all seen examples, especially with return to office mandates, sweeping return to office mandates, where just because you get people back together in a physical space doesn't actually mean anything. Like it can be just as disjointed and disconnected.
Yeah.
Lots of people, as the anecdote goes,
Mhm.
people return to office to spend all day in Teams meetings or Zoom meetings with people
Right.
who are three offices down, right? Like
Yes.
that happens, right? And obviously, there's no
Yes.
intentionality around that.
Right.
On the other hand, you can be fully remote and, maybe only every once in a while via an offsite or something like that, get together in person. But you can do it in incredibly intentional ways to foster and make sure that there is constant connection. And it can be super meaningful and valuable to that team. And of course, hybrid can too. And so, yeah, it's all about as leaders setting aside perhaps our assumptions about how it has happened in the past and how it needs to happen in the present and the future, and just have conversations with your folks around, what they think good connection, how it could be fostered and created and maintained.
Yeah.
And just be open to, to like what this could look like, because you're absolutely right. I think while the fundamentals of leadership and leadership as a human enterprise has not changed in 10,000 years, how we go about
Mhm.
manifesting our leadership within these changing times probably will,
Right.
in some ways, shift and adjust,
Yeah.
compared to maybe previous generations, recent generations.
Yeah, and that differentiation between, the what may not have changed, but the how is
Yeah.
changed. We've got
Yep.
increasing modalities and different technologies and different, ways of exploring the how. It can be really exciting if we're thoughtful about it. If we expect it to happen of its own volition, right, of its own accord, we're going to be
Hmm.
disappointed.
Hmm.
But I think actually there's a real opportunity. So one of the things I think that came out of one of the Gallup polls about hybrid work. There was a book that the guys who run Gallup, talking about how self-directed teams, so teams who are able to make their own decisions about how and when, where they come together, actually have the highest levels of engagement. So the sort of top-down, sort of mandate about hybrid or a back-to-work policy that has created a lot of discontent. But where people have within their function, we may have some sort of overlying, high level organizational needs, but actually within the teams themselves, or within the functions themselves, the more that they have the ability to determine when and how they interact together, the higher the levels of engagement are going to be. And then, so that's some food for thought. Also, one of the things that Peter Capelli just said, I just mentioned him, it's worth noting that the hybrid, the hybrid workplace challenges are far more acute in urban and large organization settings, right? Because, if I'm running a tire shop, in North Carolina here, I don't have to worry about a back to work policy because we have to be on site to install tires. That's very different from if I'm running a tech company out of San Francisco that has no headquarters, as some of my clients do. So it's really understanding like the context does drive that behavior too.
Yeah, 100%. The context is always going to be vital, and the how, of how all of these things are done. And as you mentioned, the why stays fairly consistent. The how, we have to be adaptable and be willing and able to pivot as necessary. And I'll say too, as someone who really appreciates the opportunity to be self-directed, have autonomy, to work remotely, I also very much like going into the office. I very much like interacting person to person with my fellow human beings and my coworkers,
Yeah,
especially
me
when we're
too.
doing collaborative things.
Yeah.
Like I would much prefer be together in a room with folks when we're doing collaborative things and having collaborative discussions, with the flexibility, to provide accommodation for folks if they can't happen to make it that particular day via Zoom or whatever. I mean, that's a great benefit, and we can leverage that. And so. I recognize that I really like that and I appreciate that. But I also recognize, that some people really only want to be in the office. Other people really, for a variety of reasons, maybe it's life stage, career stage, family stage, home responsibilities, whatever. Some people really only want to be remote. And so, some of this just comes back to talent pipeline and like trying to think creatively about like how do we attract and retain the best people and then engage them in a meaningful way within the work community, while still, recognizing that there's going to be difference across what people need, what they prefer, and how they feel that connection.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think so we talked about the creation of that intentional creation of the community or the space in which people operate and how they do their best work. And so, one of the things I think an evolution in leadership that's necessary is understanding. It's a little more of a pull function than a push modality, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a pull, and like let me understand what it is that what people are motivated by, instead of just having an expectation and then imposing that. And I think that's one of the differentiators that we have seen is that sort of people are able to have, and thankfully so, right? They're able to have more impact and more input on how they do their best work. That also allows us to include people who previously wouldn't have thrived in an organizational construct or an organizational setting, the sort of traditional top-down hierarchical organizational structure. And I think that in this world, that is going to be a differentiator. So how do people who think differently, how are they able to contribute in ways that may be asynchronous or they may be, differentiated? They may do their best work at 2 a.m. That's where the creative juices sometimes get stoked. And so, being able to have that, create that container for the best work to be done is going to unlock potential in others. And that ultimately is the role of a leader.
Yeah, yes, unlocking potential. And you bring up an interesting point. There's a wide range of, diverse motivations and perspectives and diverse optimization for different folks. And one thing we haven't explicitly mentioned, but it really arises from your comment you just made, is neurodiversity in the workforce. And so someone on the autism spectrum, other forms of neurodiversity, it wasn't all that long ago that all the rage was open office configurations, right?
Yeah.
And, this is going to foster collaboration, all that kind of stuff. Well, enough time has gone by, enough studies have happened, that we've discovered, lo and behold, surprising, hopefully to not many, is that it depends, right? Like just having an open office setup in and of itself isn't going to do anything to enhance collaboration. It can if you use it intentionally,
Mhm.
but it won't just magically create it. And many studies have actually shown when not leveraged correctly, it actually reduces collaboration.
Yeah.
People just try to get into their box and put on their headphones and like try
Put
to
on the
like
headphones and disappear.
yeah,
Yeah.
try to get separate everything else out. And that, of course, has the opposite effect of what they were going for, right?
Mm.
Well, when you bring in neurodiversity into the equation, those sorts of things are just amplified, right? And so someone who is on the autism spectrum is not going to want to be in, and they're not going to want to be, but they're also not going to thrive in an open office context, right? But
Yeah.
they very well may thrive in a remote with sometimes human connection hybrid kind of an environment where they can work whatever hours they happen to be, really, getting in a flow state or whatever. And, I imagine you see that all the time with your tech clients, in tech companies in particular, because there's a disproportionately higher number of folks who are neurodiverse that often end up in those organizations and in those fields.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's a bit of an aside, and it's a bit of a niche kind of subtopic. But if we're trying to create inclusive workplaces where we have community, it just highlights the need for understanding your people, understanding difference, and creating community in ways that may go beyond what it meant to build community in the workplace even 5 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, neurodiversity is sort of a big topic. I've seen that surface, amongst my clients, but just in general, neurodiversity. And where previously the aspects of neurodiversity that inhibit executive functioning, that's one of the key sort of drivers behind ADHD as an example. Like it sometimes inhibits in a way that can to the outside world appear to be procrastination or laziness, but actually it's just waiting for that moment the conditions where somebody actually is in the zone and do their best work. But previously in an organization, that may have been perceived very, very differently. And so now we have the technology to be able to, there's AI tools now that can really help with executive function. So they put the infrastructure around the individual so that they can actually do their best work. That to me is, the aspect of technology that not just helps us to optimize, but actually to actualize. And, we're still figuring it out. Like, that we're still having this sort of very dichotomous relationship with technology, particularly around sort of teenagers, where we're sort of banning it in school, or we're, putting in the rules of the road. And that typically, if I go back through history, that does tend to happen where there's a window of time in which the technology arrives. Like I think about the automobile, like, the technology arrives and then we sort of think about how do we apply it? How do we apply it in a way that allows us to maximize the benefits of this new technology? But then we also realize there are constraints and risks with it. So we need seatbelts, we need speed limits, we need, traffic lights, we need, tarmac roads. We need these things that can help us to actually get the best out of the technology as it stands. And they typically come after the technology is available. And so we're in this window right now where I think people are exploring that and figuring it out. If I look back through history, my trust and faith is that we'll figure out some way of optimizing this to be better. But I think that we also need to think about, and this is essential for leaders to think about, is not just about efficiency and effectiveness, because that is how we optimize technology and we optimize people using technology, but actually to help people to self-actualize.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that's a good place to kind of wrap things up. It's kind of where you started, kind of where we're ending. Is
Mhm.
let's zoom out. Let's take a bigger holistic historical perspective on this because everyone is, afraid of disruption and technological disruption is not new. Technological disruption has happened since, the wheel and, like any time there's
Right.
anything like there's new disruption and it displaces certain tasks or certain jobs, but it also creates new opportunities. And there's a lot of complexity around it. There's a lot of disruption and nuance and fear that's created anytime we have these new disruptive technologies. But yeah, if you take a long view and take a historical view,
Mhm.
maybe it'll be a little less scary. Maybe we can learn to lean into it a little bit more, and maybe we can also not forget how important it is to keep the human component ever present, regardless of whatever that new technology happens to be. Right now, it's, AI, deep machine learning. 20 years, 25 years ago, it was the internet. Before that, it was, name the thing, right? Like every generation has its thing, and we'll continue to have ours. Maybe the next big thing is quantum computing, in conjunction with AI and whatever. And yeah, will that change things? For sure, it will change things. But we'll figure it out. And I do have, a belief and a faith in humanity that we'll be able to figure it out. But let's not neglect our role as leaders to help prepare that path and to help bring people along and to continue to focus on the human, to the community piece as we go into this unknown future together.
Yeah, stay human is is my current phrase. I
Yeah.
brought it from Jazz Razul, who I met at the Columbia Coaching Conference. But staying human, somebody who's, like we have to think about these tools are really good at helping us to be more effective and efficient. How do we leverage them to allow us to be connective and collaborative and creative in ways that are essentially human, that's hard to replicate in ways that are essentially human?
Yeah, I love it. This has just been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for all of your insights, for your time, for everything that you've shared with me and my audience today. As we start to wrap up, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, and then give us the final word for today.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate that. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, Jamie Ramsden. The website is adastraleadership.com, adastraleadership.com. The book you can find at Amazon is called Let's Go, How Great Leaders Shape the Future. And so my last thought for today is really about how leaders should be thinking about if there's a sort of tactical or practical nugget. It's number one about creating the container for people to be able to do their best work, either technology enabled or otherwise. But secondly, the leaders can have, and again, that's something that you can do, that's creating a space, that's intentionality, but something that you can hold on with yourself is the curiosity to try and figure out how other people are motivated. Many of the leaders I work with, most of my clients are CEOs in large billion-dollar organizations. And the curiosity to look beyond the behavior and try and understand how other people are motivated. Because to your point, if we get everybody who looks like us and sounds like us and acts like us, we don't have a team. We have a collection of individuals.
Right.
And so if we can be inclusive and thoughtful, intentional, and curious about what motivates other people, then we can speak to that motivation in a way that unlocks their potential. We can create a pathway for them, that allows them to do their best work and to see their pathway forward. And in doing so, we create the conditions for us to have sustainable and high levels of impact. And long may that continue.
Yeah, amen to that. Jamie, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Jamie can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe. They can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.